My name is Lydia Kincaid. I am 31 years old, and on Saturday, the 18th of April 2026, my mother came back from Target with an empty bag and no little girl beside her. She set the bag on the kitchen island like it was proof of something, folded her hands around her coffee mug, and smiled the same small smile she used when she wanted a room to understand she had won. "I left Willa there," she said. "Maybe now she'll learn not every room is built around her." For 1 second, nobody moved. My father, Raymond, stood by the sink with a spoon in his hand, stirring sugar into coffee he had already stirred. The spoon tapped the ceramic once, then stopped. He looked at the back door instead of me. That was how my father survived my mother. He found exits without leaving. There was no Willa, no bunny purse hanging from her wrist, no yellow rain jacket on the hook by the mudroom, no wooden picture frame she had been so excited to buy for my grandfather's 83rd birthday. Just the empty bag, a folded receipt, and my mother's face, calm as church glass. 8 miles away, my 6-year-old daughter was standing at guest services inside the Target at Turkey Creek, holding a $14.99 frame in both hands, and asking a stranger if Grandma forgot her because she had been bad. I did not scream. I did not ask my mother why, because women like Marlene Voss collect questions and turn them into evidence against you. I picked up my coffee cup, rinsed it, placed it upside down in the drying rack, and walked into the laundry room. Then I locked the door and made 2 calls. The first found my daughter. The second erased my mother's inheritance. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 88% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. My grandfather answered on the second ring. He did not say hello. Amos Whitaker was turning 83 the following week, but his voice still had the flat steadiness of a man who had spent 40 years telling contractors where to set a load of lumber and expecting them to listen. "Lydia." I pressed my palm against the dryer because it was warm and solid, and I needed something in that house to be both. Behind the laundry room door, I could hear my mother moving a chair across the kitchen tile. Not rushing, not worried. Just rearranging the morning around herself. "Granddad," I said. Mom left Willa alone at Target. There was a silence. 7 seconds. I counted them because I have always counted when I am scared. The dryer hummed under my hand. Somewhere in the hallway, my father coughed once and then became quiet again. Then my grandfather asked, "Is the child safe?" "Yes. Guest services. A manager is with her. Police are there." "Are you driving to her?" "I'm leaving now." "Did Marlene leave the store without her?" I closed my eyes. That was the question that told me he already knew more than I did. "Yes," I said. "She came back here alone." He took one breath. Not a gasp. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something that had been waiting for permission. "Then I'm opening the porch light," he said. I did not know what that meant. Not then. I knew the porch light itself, of course. The yellow one outside my grandparents' back door in Maryville, the one my grandmother Mabel turned on every evening before sunset, even when nobody was expected. She used to say a lit porch was a promise. I thought he was speaking from grief. People do that when someone they love is gone. They reach for old phrases because the new ones hurt too much. But my grandfather was not being poetic. At 11:48 that morning, while I was still standing between the washer and dryer with my keys in my hand, Amos Whitaker called Harriet Sloan, my grandmother's estate attorney. Harriet was 67, wore gray cardigans in every season, and had the kind of voice that made people sit up straighter before they understood why. She drove to her office on a Saturday. She unlocked the back door herself. She went into the records room and opened the lower drawer of a fireproof cabinet. Inside was a cream-colored file tied with yellow ribbon. Across the front, in Mabel's handwriting, were the words "Porch Light File." Underneath, smaller, she had written, "For the day Marlene uses a child as leverage." Inside were 5 sealed letters, 2 audio recordings, a trust amendment, a medical capacity letter signed by a neurologist, and one note written in blue ink on recipe paper. If she makes the little girl pay for grown people's jealousy, do not warn her. Act. My grandmother had been dead 14 months. But on that Saturday morning, while my mother sat in that kitchen believing the worst part of the day was already over, Mabel Whitaker was still the only woman in our family standing in the doorway. To understand why my grandmother wrote those words, you have to understand what my mother meant when she called me capable. In other families, maybe that word means trusted. In mine, it meant unattended. The first time I remember hearing it, I was 7 years old, sitting on the concrete steps outside Miss Laurel's dance studio in a pink leotard with one strap twisted under my arm. Class had ended at 4:30. By 5:16, the lobby lights were off and Miss Laurel was standing beside me with her purse over her shoulder, pretending not to be irritated. My mother pulled up in her silver Buick, rolled down the window, and said, "Lydia, don't look so tragic. You're a capable girl." She did not apologize. She did not hurry out of the car. She just leaned over and moved a stack of church flyers off the passenger seat so I could climb in. When I was 12, my father came down with the flu the same weekend my mother hosted a women's luncheon at First Covenant. She left a pot of soup on the stove and told me to keep an eye on him. Raymond slept on the sofa with a fever towel across his forehead while I stood on a chair to reach the medicine cabinet. My mother came home with compliments about her centerpiece arrangements and told everyone at dinner how proud she was that I had handled the house. When I was 29, I spent my lunch breaks driving Mabel to radiation appointments while my mother stayed busy organizing a charity auction for families in crisis. She used that phrase a lot. Families in crisis. It sounded better when the family was not ours. And when Willa was born, I went back to work after 8 weeks because Marlene said some women did not get the luxury of falling apart. I had stitches that still pulled when I climbed stairs. I had a baby who cried every evening at 6, as if she had an appointment with grief. My mother came by twice. Both times she took pictures with Willa near the window and posted them with captions about grandmotherhood. Mabel was the first person who named it for me. She was standing at her kitchen sink, rinsing a yellow mug, the porch light already glowing behind her, though the sun had not fully gone down. "When your mother calls you capable, sweetheart," she said, "she means useful." I laughed because I thought she was being sharp. She did not laugh back. It took me 24 years to understand that my mother had not raised me to be strong. She had raised me to be convenient. But that Saturday at Target, she chose the wrong child to leave unattended. Willa was never the kind of child who demanded attention. That was the part my mother could never understand. She did not perform sweetness. She did not climb into laps to win rooms. She did not interrupt adults unless something was bleeding, burning, or about to fall. She noticed things. The first time she noticed my grandfather's hearing, she was 4. We were at his kitchen table in Maryville, the old oak one with a pale burn mark near the edge from where Mabel had once set down a hot pie plate without a towel. Amos was sitting at the head of the table, pretending to follow a conversation with my mother while missing half of it. Willa watched him for a while, her chin barely above her plate. Then she picked up her chair with both hands, dragged it around the table, and sat on his left side. My mother laughed and said, "Well, somebody wants to be special today." Willa looked at her, confused. "No," she said, "Pop hears better over here." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a child says something everyone else has chosen not to say. My grandfather looked down at her. His fork was still in his hand. For a second, he did not move. Then he reached over and tapped the table twice with his knuckles, the way he used to do when a customer at the hardware store gave him exact change. "Smart girl," he said. Mabel smiled from the stove, one hand resting on the kettle. She had known, of course. Mabel knew the weak places in people without using them against anyone. She knew Amos favored his left ear. She knew Raymond disappeared to porches when conversations became honest. She knew Marlene could make cruelty sound like concern if the lighting was good enough. And she knew Willa was paying attention. During Mabel's last months, Willa treated that house like it had feelings. She watered the basil plant on the back steps, because Mabel said basil sulked if ignored. She folded the throw blanket on Amos's chair even when he was going to unfold it 5 minutes later. She put the television remote in the blue bowl by the lamp, because that was where Mabel said lost things should learn to live. Every evening before we left, Willa would stand on her toes and flip on the porch light. "Even if we're going?" I asked her once. She nodded. "Great. Grandma says houses get lonely too." That sentence did something to Amos. I saw it pass across his face, quick and painful, like sunlight hitting a bruise. After Mabel died, he stopped correcting Willa when she kept turning the light on. He would just stand in the hallway with one hand on the wall and watch her do it. Then came the accident in December of 2025. Amos had gone into the garage for a box of Christmas ornaments, the red one Mabel labeled in black marker back in 1998. His shoe caught on the bottom step. He went down hard. Willa was in the living room coloring cardinals on printer paper. She heard the sound and did not scream. She did what Mabel had taught her. She pressed the emergency button on her little watch and told the dispatcher, "My pop fell down. I am Willa. I am 6. The watch knows where I am." The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. Amos had a fractured wrist, 6 stitches near his eyebrow, and a new way of looking at my daughter. Not as a cute child. Not as a favorite. As someone Mabel had trusted with instructions. On Christmas Eve, he raised his glass before dinner and said, "To Willa, she keeps your grandmother's light on." My mother did not speak. She smiled, but only with the part of her face people photograph. Later, when I walked past the pantry, I heard her voice behind the half-closed door. "Daddy should not say things like that in front of everyone," she said. "It confuses the child. It teaches her to expect more than her place." No one answered her. That was when I should have understood. My mother was not jealous because Willa was loved. She was jealous because Willa was believed. Belief was the thing my mother could not control. She could manage appearances. She could arrange flowers in the fellowship hall and make a casserole look like mercy. She could put one hand on someone's shoulder and lower her voice until concern sounded almost holy. But she could not make Mabel misunderstand her. By the summer of 2024, Mabel was weaker than she wanted anyone to know. She had a blue robe she wore most mornings, soft at the elbows, and a pair of slippers Amos kept warming near the kitchen vent because her feet were always cold. She moved slowly then. Not carefully. Slowly. There is a difference. Careful people are afraid of breaking something. Slow people have already made peace with what is breaking. My mother mistook that slowness for absence. She started saying things in rooms where Mabel sat quietly by the window. Small things, polished things. "Daddy needs help making decisions now. Lydia is too emotional where Willa is concerned." It isn't healthy for a child to think she has that much influence over an old man. Once, in July, I walked in through the back door and heard my mother speaking to Pastor Hank Bell in the dining room. Her voice was soft, but it carried. It always carried when she wanted witnesses. "Daddy is too attached to that little girl," she said. "It's confusing his judgment." Mabel was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of iced tea in front of her. Her hands were folded around the glass, but she was not drinking. Her eyes were on the hallway, not on me. She had heard every word. That afternoon, after my mother left, Mabel asked me to take Willa outside to water the basil. When I came back in, the kitchen table had changed. The iced tea was gone. In its place was a green notebook, a stack of old recipe cards, and the blue pen Amos kept by the phone. Mabel covered the notebook with one hand when I walked in. "Some recipes are not for sharing yet," she said. I thought she meant food. She did not. Months later, Harriet Sloan would tell me what was in that notebook. Dates, times, sentences, patterns. My mother asking about trust distributions. My mother suggesting Amos should stop signing checks alone. My mother calling me unstable in one breath and asking to be added to school pickup forms in the next. My mother saying Willa performed sweetness as if a 6-year-old child had invented tenderness to steal property. Mabel wrote all of it down. On the 3rd of August 2024, Harriet came to the house during a hard rain. Amos was at a cardiology appointment with Raymond. My mother thought Mabel was asleep. Mabel was not asleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table in her blue robe, with the porch light on at 2 in the afternoon because the storm had made the whole house dim. Harriet opened her laptop. Mabel did not look at the screen. "What exactly are you afraid Marlene will do?" Harriet asked. Mabel looked toward the back door. "She will scare the child," she said, "and call it a lesson." Harriet was quiet after that. Mabel slid the notebook across the table. Her fingers shook, but her voice did not. She asked for a trust amendment. Not a threat, not a warning. A mechanism. If Marlene placed Willa in physical danger to influence Amos, Lydia, or any distribution of family assets, Marlene's expected share would be redirected into a protected education and safety fund for Willa. Harriet asked if she was certain. Mabel said, "I will not be here to stand in the doorway, so the papers will have to stand there for me." Then, she signed her name. It took 3 tries. The first line broke, the second drifted, the third held. That was the signature waiting in the porch light file 14 months later, when my mother walked back into a kitchen without my daughter and believed nobody had seen her coming. The morning my mother tested that signature began with lemon cake. Saturday, the 18th of April, 2026, came in gray and wet over Knoxville. Not storming, just a thin, steady rain that made the streets shine and the dogwoods look too white against the sky. Willa wore her yellow rain jacket even though the forecast said it would clear by noon. She had chosen it herself because, she said, "Pop likes bright things on cloudy days." We pulled into my mother's driveway in Farragut at 9:20. Her house looked the way it always looked when she expected people to believe something about her. The porch swept, the ferns watered, the brass mailbox polished. Through the front window, I could see the dining room table already set with cloth napkins and the good white plates she never used unless there was either company or guilt. My mother opened the door before I knocked. "There are my girls," she said, warm enough for a camera. Willa stepped closer to my leg. My father was at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper without turning the page. He had a mug beside him and one hand resting flat on the sports section. He looked at Willa and softened for half a second. "Morning bug," he said. Willa gave him a small wave. The kitchen smelled like coffee, lemon glaze, and bacon. My mother had probably reheated from the day before. On the island sat a lemon pound cake under a glass dome. Beside it was a wooden recipe box I had not seen since Mabel's house. It was pale maple, with one dark knot near the latch, and my grandmother's handwriting across the top in faded black marker. Marlene saw me notice it. "I've been meaning to give that to you," she said. "Your grandmother wanted you to have it. I kept forgetting." She said forgetting the way other people say misplacing a scarf, not withholding something that still smelled faintly like the pantry where Mabel kept flour in glass jars. I touched the lid but did not open it. My mother poured coffee into my cup before I sat down. "You look tired." "I'm fine. You always say that." "Because you trained me to," I thought. Willa stood near the sliding door, watching rain collect on the patio stones. My mother looked at her over the rim of her mug. "Willa," she said brightly, "Pop's birthday is next week. Would you like to help Grandma pick out a present? Just you and me. Target won't take long." Willa turned around slowly. "The Target with the red balls outside? That's the one." My mother smiled like this was tender, like she had not spent months complaining that Willa had too much of Amos's attention. Like she had not called my daughter a performance in rooms where sick women listened. I should have said no. I know that now. But that morning, the recipe box sat between my hands like a small, wooden trap. I opened it and saw Mabel's cards arranged by category. Cakes, soups, holiday, handwritten notes tucked between them. A photograph slid loose and landed on the counter. Mabel in 1983, standing in front of the hardware store with Amos behind her, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. My chest tightened. My mother knew exactly where to place grief, so I would look down. Willa came to my chair and whispered, "Is Grandma safe today?" The question went through me so cleanly, I almost stood up. My mother heard it. Of course she did. She laughed softly. "Oh, Lydia, don't make her nervous. Children borrow fear from their mothers." My father folded the edge of his newspaper. He did not look up. I looked at Willa's face. 6 years old, serious eyes, yellow hood hanging down her back, her little bunny purse across her chest with $16 inside, money she had saved from tooth fairy bills and quarters Amos gave her for helping sort screws in the garage. 30 minutes, I said to my mother. Bring her straight back. Marlene lifted one hand like a promise. Of course, she said. Don't make motherhood so dramatic. At 10:05, they left in my mother's white Lexus. Willa turned at the end of the walkway and waved with 2 fingers. I remember that because Mabel used to wave the same way when her hands hurt. Then the car backed out into the rain, turned toward Kingston Pike, and disappeared behind the wet trees. I sat back down at the island. The recipe card on top was for lemon pound cake. At the bottom, in Mabel's handwriting, was one sentence I did not understand until later. Porch lights are for the ones coming home. At Target, my mother did not rush. That was what would bother me later, more than almost anything. Not the leaving by itself, although that was enough to split my life in half. It was the time she took to make the leaving look ordinary. Security footage would show her walking through the sliding doors at 10:12 with Willa beside her. My daughter was holding the strap of her bunny purse with one hand and my mother's sleeve with the other. Not her hand, her sleeve. Willa had always understood distance better than most adults. They passed the dollar bins first. Willa stopped for a pack of cardinal stickers because Mabel used to say cardinals were visitors from people who loved you from somewhere else. My mother let her put them in the cart. Then they went to the home aisle, where Willa found the wooden frame. It was small, walnut-colored plastic, though Willa thought it was real wood. The corners were rounded. The price was $14.99. She held it against her chest and said, "This one looks like Pop's table." My mother was not looking at the frame. She was looking at herself in the black mirror of her phone screen. At 10:38, they reached self-checkout. My mother bought the frame, the stickers, and a bottle of sparkling water. She paid with her debit card. The receipt printed. She tore it loose and folded it twice. Then she handed the Target bag to Willa. "Stand right here," she said. "Grandma is going to pull the car around." Willa nodded, because children raised around careful adults learn that obedience is safer than questions. My mother walked out through the automatic doors at 10:44. She did not pull the car around. She sat in her white Lexus in the parking lot, angled near the cart return, and started a Facebook Live for the women's ministry group at First Covenant. Brooke Mallory, who lived 2 doors down from my parents and never missed anything involving public emotion, would save the video before my mother deleted it. In it, my mother's voice was soft, almost tired. "Sometimes grandmothers have to carry what young mothers refuse to carry," she said, looking just past the camera as if humility had a horizon. "Pray for me today. I am trying to teach gratitude without breaking anyone's heart." Inside the store, Willa waited. 10 minutes. 18. 29. She stood near the end of self-checkout with the bag looped around her wrist and the frame pressed flat to her stomach. People passed her with carts full of paper towels, cereal, Easter clearance candy. One woman smiled at her. A man in a University of Tennessee cap asked if she was waiting for her mom. Willa said, "My grandma is getting the car." By 11:13, Celeste Yarbrough from Guest Services noticed that the little girl with the yellow jacket had not moved. Celeste was 54, with reading glasses on a chain, and 3 grandchildren of her own. She walked over slowly, not wanting to scare her. "Sweetheart," she said, "where's your grown-up?" Willa looked up at her. She did not cry. That was the part that made Celeste write her name down later. "She said it was a lesson," Willa said. "I'm waiting to be done learning." Celeste bent down. "What kind of lesson?" Willa tightened both hands around the bag. "If I cry," she asked, "does that mean I failed?" At 11:36, My mother walked back into her own kitchen with the empty Target bag and set it on the island in front of me. She had removed the frame, she had left the child, and she still believed she was the person teaching the lesson. I did not ask her where my daughter was. Asking would have given her the room she wanted. My mother had built that moment like a stage, and questions were the spotlight. She wanted panic. She wanted my voice to break. She wanted my father to watch me become the unstable woman she had been describing to people in soft rooms for years. So, I looked at the clock on the microwave instead. 11:36. Then I looked at the bag. The red plastic was folded inward where her hand had crushed it. The receipt was gone. The frame was gone. Willa was gone. My father stood near the back door, one hand on the brass knob. He had not stepped outside yet, not this time. His face looked emptied out, like a house after an estate sale. "Marlene," he said. It was only her name, but it was the first thing he had said in a room like that in years. My mother turned toward him with the expression she used when a man disappointed her in public. "She is fine," she said. "The store is full of people. Lydia makes that child anxious." I thought a few minutes without everyone worshipping her might help. I remember thinking how clean the kitchen was, how the lemon cake was still under the glass dome, how the recipe box sat open in front of my chair, Mabel's handwriting exposed like a witness nobody had called yet. I picked up my purse from the counter. My mother laughed once, not loudly. "Don't be dramatic." That was when I walked away from her. Not fast. Fast would have made her happy. I walked down the short hall past the framed family photos where I was always on the edge, and Vanessa's children, my cousins, were always centered. I went into the laundry room, shut the door, and turned the lock. The room was narrow and warm, a load of towels tumbled in the dryer. My yellow raincoat hung from a hook beside a bottle of stain remover. I took my phone out with both hands, because one hand did not feel like enough. I called Target first. Not 911. Not Amos. Not my mother again. Target. A woman answered on the fourth ring, cheerful in the trained way. Customer service people are cheerful before they understand the shape of your emergency. "Target Turkey Creek, how can I help you?" "My name is Lydia Kincaid," I said. My voice sounded so steady, I almost did not recognize it. "My 6-year-old daughter, Willa Kincaid, was brought to your store by my mother, Marlene Voss. My mother has returned home without her. I need you to confirm whether my child is safe." The cheerfulness left the woman's voice. "Ma'am, please hold." I held for 42 seconds. I know because the dryer timer was blinking beside me, and counting was the only thing I could do without coming apart. A man came on the line. "Mrs. Kincaid, this is Officer Jonah Reeves with Knoxville Police. Your daughter is safe. She is with our guest services manager, Celeste Yarbrough. She has not been harmed." I put one hand over my mouth, not to cry. To keep the sound inside my body where Willa could not hear it through a phone. "Is she alone?" I asked. She was unattended for approximately 29 minutes before staff approached her. "We are reviewing footage now. Are you able to come to the store?" "I'm leaving now." "Drive carefully," he said. "She's calm. She has a juice box. She's holding a picture frame." That was the sentence that nearly did it. The frame. Not because it mattered, because it did. I thanked him, hung up, and called my grandfather. He answered before the second ring finished. I told him only what he needed. Willa was safe. Police were present. Marlene had left the store alone. Amos listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Drive to the child. Harriet will drive to your mother." I unlocked the laundry room door and stepped back into the kitchen. My mother was still standing by the island. My father had not gone outside. His hand was still on the knob, but he was facing the room now. I said, "Do not call me. Do not follow me. Do not come near my daughter." My mother opened her mouth. I did not stay to hear what she named it. I walked out into the rain, got in my car, and drove toward Target with both hands on the wheel, knowing my daughter was alive and understanding, for the first time, that alive was not the same thing as unharmed. The drive to Target took 18 minutes. I remember every red light because each one felt personal. Kingston Pike was slick with rain, and every brake light ahead of me looked like a warning I had ignored too late. I kept both hands on the wheel. 10 and 2. The way my driving instructor taught me when I was 16. Before I understood that control was sometimes just the shape your hands made around terror. By the time I pulled into the lot, the rain had thinned to mist. Families were walking out with carts and umbrellas and paper bags of things they would forget buying by Tuesday. The ordinary world had kept moving while my daughter stood inside it wondering what lesson she was supposed to learn. I walked through the sliding doors and saw the red carts, the dollar bins, the bright overhead lights. A baby was crying near the pharmacy. A woman was comparing shampoo bottles. Somewhere, a scanner beeped again and again. Nothing in that store knew it had become the place where my childhood reached forward and put its hands on my child. Celeste Yarbrough was waiting near guest services. I knew it was her before she said her name. She had the posture of a woman who had already decided where she stood. Beside her was Officer Jonah Reeves, broad-shouldered, calm, holding a clipboard against his chest. And then I saw Willa. She was sitting on a gray plastic chair, with her feet swinging above the floor, her yellow rain jacket unzipped, her bunny purse across her lap. In one hand, she held a juice box. In the other, she held the wooden frame. The target bag was tucked beside her like evidence. She saw me and stood up slowly. Not running. That hurt more than running would have. I knelt before she reached me, and she stepped into my arms with the carefulness of a child who was not sure whether she had permission to fall apart. I stayed where Grandma told me, she whispered into my shoulder. You did exactly right, I said. Every single thing. She pulled back just enough to look at my face. Was I hard to teach? I felt something inside me go very still. No, baby, I said. There was nothing wrong with you. The lesson was not yours. Her mouth trembled once. She looked down at the frame. Does Pop still want it? I put my hands on both sides of her face. Pop wants you. The present is just something he gets to hold. Officer Reeves gave me the report before we left. I read the line once, then folded it carefully. Minor left unattended by maternal grandmother. Celeste touched my arm and said quietly. She kept apologizing for taking too long to learn. I thanked her because words were all I had in public. Then I carried my daughter out of Target with the frame pressed between us, understanding that my mother had not just left Willa in a store. She had tried to leave a question inside her. Am I easy to abandon? While I was carrying Willa out of Target, Harriet Sloan was driving toward my mother's house with Mabel's file on the passenger seat. I did not see that part happen. Amos told me later. Raymond filled in what he could. Harriet corrected both of them, where memory tried to soften things. She arrived at 2:30 inches the afternoon. The rain had stopped by then, but the porch was still wet, and my mother had not bothered to turn on the outside light. That detail would have bothered Mabel. Harriet noticed it because Harriet noticed everything that looked like intention, pretending to be accident. My mother opened the door in the same white cardigan she had worn to breakfast. Her lipstick had faded at the center. My father stood several feet behind her in the hallway, not outside, not hidden, not yet brave, but present. Harriet held up the cream-colored file. Marlene, she said, I'm here under instructions from your mother. My mother gave a small laugh. My mother is dead. Harriet stepped inside without asking. Not in this file. She placed the porch light file on the coffee table in the formal living room, the room my mother used for guests she wanted to impress but not feed. Then she laid out the first pieces one by one. A copy of the Target incident report Officer Reeves had already emailed. A still image from the store entrance showing my mother leaving alone at 10:44. A screenshot from Brooke Mallory's saved video. My mother sitting in her Lexus, speaking about teaching gratitude while Willa waited inside. A printed letter from Dr. Anjali Mercer, the neurologist who had evaluated Amos the previous fall and confirmed full cognitive capacity. My mother looked at the last page and went pale in a way powder could not hide. Daddy is being influenced, she said. Harriet did not answer that. She opened a small recorder and pressed play. Mabel's voice came out thin, lower than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. Marlene, if Harriet is playing this, then you used a child to move a grown man's money, pity, or attention. I prayed I was wrong. I prepared as if I was not. My father sat down on the edge of the armchair. Not in it. On the edge, like comfort had become inappropriate. My mother stared at the recorder. She was sick, she said. She didn't know what she was saying. Harriet slid another document across the table. Your mother signed this in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. Your father reaffirmed the amendment after her death. He was evaluated twice. She hated me at the end, my mother whispered. No, Harriet said. She documented you. That was the first sentence that broke something. Then Harriet played the second recording, not Mabel this time, but my mother's own voice from July of 2024, captured on the kitchen recorder Mabel had left running beside the recipe box. That child has too much power over him, Marlene said through the speaker. If Lydia cannot control her, someone should. The room changed after that. My father looked up. My mother looked at him, and for once, he did not look away. You said that? He asked. She opened her mouth, but no sentence came out clean. Harriet gathered the pages back into order. This is notice, she said. The formal meeting is Thursday. Amos asked me to tell you one thing before then. My mother was crying by then, but quietly, because Harriet was not an audience. Harriet closed the file. He said, Mabel saw her first. I am only catching up. Thursday came with clean weather, which felt almost rude. The sky over Maryville was bright enough to make every window in my grandfather's house look awake. I arrived at 1:40 with Willa's backpack in one hand and the target frame wrapped in brown paper in the other. Amos opened the door himself. He looked smaller than he had at Christmas, but not weaker. There is a difference there too. Willa stayed in the living room with a box of crayons and a plate of apple slices. Celeste had come because Amos asked to thank her in person, and because I needed one adult in that house who had seen my daughter as a child before anyone saw her as evidence. At exactly 2, my mother walked in wearing navy blue and pearls. Raymond came behind her. He did not touch her elbow. That was the first thing I noticed. Marlene noticed it too. Harriet had cleared the dining table. No flowers, no coffee, no lemon cake. Just the porch light file, the target report, the saved Facebook video, the trust amendment, and a small brass lamp Mabel used to keep on her nightstand. Amos sat at one end of the table. I sat across from my mother. Raymond stood near the doorway until Amos looked at him and said, Sit or stand, Ray, but choose it yourself. Raymond sat beside me. My mother's face changed by 1 inch. Enough. Harriet opened the file and said, This is not a negotiation. This is notice. No one moved. As of this morning, she continued, Marlene Voss is removed as successor trustee of the Whitaker Family Trust. Lydia Kincaid is appointed in her place. Mrs. Voss's monthly distribution of $3,600 will taper to 0 over 60 days. Her access to the Teleco cabin is revoked. All charitable reimbursements drawn through the trust are frozen pending review. My mother looked at Amos. Daddy. Harriet turned 1 page. The expected inheritance previously allocated to Mrs. Voss, estimated at $910,000, has been redirected to the Willa Kincaid Education and Safety Fund. Mrs. Voss will receive $10 under the symbolic inheritance clause to reduce grounds for contest. The room was very quiet. My mother pressed one hand flat to the table. I made a mistake. Harriet placed the police report in front of her. Minor left unattended by maternal grandmother, she read. My mother's eyes filled. I am still her mother. For the first time all afternoon, Amos spoke. And she is still a child. That was when Willa came to the doorway holding a red crayon. She looked at my mother, then at me. Mommy, she said, can Pop have his picture now? My mother closed her eyes, like the frame had cost more than the money. What I learned from that day is that family is not proven by blood, last names, holidays, or the photographs people frame for the hallway. Family is proven in the moment when someone vulnerable is standing alone and afraid, and you have the power to either protect them or explain them away. My mother believed love was something that could be performed. She knew how to look generous in public. She knew how to speak softly when other people were listening. She knew how to use words like concern, forgiveness, and family until they sounded almost sacred. But love is not the language someone uses when there is an audience. Love is what they do when no one is clapping. My grandmother understood that. She was not loud. She did not win arguments at dinner. She did not humiliate anyone to prove she was right. She watched, she remembered, she prepared. And in the end, the most loving thing she ever did was not a speech. It was a signature, a file, a set of instructions left behind for a day she hoped would never come. That changed the way I see strength. For most of my life, I thought being strong meant enduring, staying quiet, keeping peace, letting people call me dramatic when I was simply telling the truth. But real strength is not how much pain you can absorb. Real strength is the day you stop handing unsafe people another chance to hurt the people you love. Sometimes healing does not look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like changing the locks, updating the school pickup list, removing a name from an emergency contact form, letting a phone ring without answering it, teaching your child that being abandoned was never proof they were hard to love. If this story stays with you, let it be because of one thing. Pay attention to who feels entitled to your silence. The people who truly love you will not ask you to make yourself smaller so they can stay comfortable. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story hit you the hardest? Have you ever had to protect your peace from someone who called themselves family? If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one.